one of the reasons that I wanted to make this film was to inform our younger members predominantly about the rich history of the POA and the struggles over the years that we've had. And I've been a part of that struggle over the last 30 years. But what I want to do eventually is pass over the baton to younger people to say, these people have represented us in the past, and they'll be my judges whether I've done a reasonable job or not for me to judge. I can only say that I've put my heart and soul into it, but it's for others to judge me when I'm long gone.
There's a policeman coming for us, Mark. Too late.
And I want to leave a union in a better place than what I found it.
I have to be honest, I never even give the POA a thought when I was a member on the shop floor, and I didn't need them because nothing had happened to me. And I guess that's the problem these days. A lot of people don't know what the union is about, don't know the benefits of being in a union, and don't know what protections and support they offer.
Whether it be from terrorists, to murderers, to rapists, just to name a few, it is prison officers who look after them on a daily basis. It is prison officers who are the forgotten people in this world when it comes to publicising and applauding the work they do. I don't believe there's another union in this country could have operated under the restrictions that the POA has had to operate under and survived.
The wide range of prison, correctional, secure psychiatric and officer support grade workers who make up the membership of the POA today encounter the threat of more extreme and constant danger at work than any other area of the UK workforce, with considerably less appreciation than that of their counterparts in other service professions. Since its official inception in 1939, for some time before that, the POA and its forerunners has sought to define the role of prison workers, defend their safety at work, and strive to improve the terms and conditions of their employment. Successive generations of POA leaders and executive committees have displayed and developed acute political acumen as well as astute media savvy when faced with some of the most draconian anti-trade union legislation seen in the history of the movement, and from successive governments of all colours. A proud and distinct history was created along the way, which will be told here in the voices of some of those who have helped create it.
These are the people who are dealing with some of the most vicious, brutal individuals in the nation and ensuring that we're relatively safe.
I always say prison staff are as much incarcerated in prisons as prisoners, so the conditions have to be good for both parties.
It's something that the vast majority of us, I think, would run a mile from doing.
It is a vocation, and I think most people, including prison officers especially, you know, we want to be proud of the work that we do. We want to do a good job and be rewarded fairly for it, but we want to be proud of the organisations and the system that we work for, and that's why the POA, I think, has had such an influential impact, because it's actually critical that we've got those voices. But what's wonderful is, as well, is trade union members wanting it to be better and coming up with practical solutions, practical policies that could make a difference, obviously to them as a staff, but also to the whole service.
And so the characteristics that bring you into being a prison officer and allow you to make a success at that career then follow through into the officials, because POA members aren't going to elect people to represent them who don't talk the talk and walk the walk.
The POA are blessed with some fantastic leaders, both past and present, all who understand, what the people in the association actually want and what they need.
Many of the gains that they've made are because that understanding of the profession and that unity in the workplace and the understanding of the job.
The government can't ignore them, whether it likes their politics or not. The important thing is they have to deal with them if they want to get the job done.
Where every emergency service rolled into one unique occupation, we give first aid, we're paramedics, we're police constables because we keep order and control, we're teachers, we're counsellors, we're psychotherapists, we're parents, we're peer figures, we're all that rolled into one. We fight fires, because human beings are unpredictable.
Being a prison officer is a demanding position. It's a position of trust. And for those prison officers who work on the wings, it is challenging from the moment they walk on that wing to the moment they leave.
You're naturally in a heightened state because essentially you're waiting for the next thing to happen.
It's become more difficult as there have been cutbacks and austerity, and prison officers have often borne the brunt of that. And the law is not a solution for these problems, and getting compensation for being assaulted is no comfort really, as opposed to not being assaulted in the first place and being properly protected. But it is important that people do get compensation, but also that employers are brought to book.
To know that should something go wrong or you need that element of support there, it's there, and you can go home and come in happy knowing that you've got that support should you need it.
The POA wants you to be able to go home safely, to earn a salary that you're going to live on and keep you safe. That's where the POA is, and that's where you need a strong trade union, not a staff association.
The prison service, when I joined in 1978, was behind the brick wall, and the public in general had no idea what went on in the prison service and what type of job they were doing. And that's what encouraged me to get involved in the trade union, to make the public more aware of what was going on behind us, what they called behind the walls.
Everyone's grateful that the criminals are kept in, but where's the gratitude for the prison officers in terms of pay and conditions and respect and health and safety, all those big issues which individually you can't really pursue, but collectively you can, and that's the vital role of a trade union. It's bringing everybody together and giving them a voice. We all stand on the shoulders of giants, but we've all got to pull together, otherwise you'll just be picked off.
I worked with the POA to become one of their voices in Parliament, so no government minister could not know what was actually happening on the ground, or could not be confronted with what was happening on the ground, because I sat in Parliament and I was listening to untruths about what was happening, and I don't think any of them realised just how serious the crisis was within our prisons. If it hadn't been for the POA, most of the government policies that have been developed would have been ill-informed all the way through.
We now have female prison officers working in male establishments, that didn't come from the prison service, that came from the POA. All the big initiatives within the prison service have actually come from the POA.
There is something special and important about being a prison officer which needs proper recognition from people who understand that. And you look at the people in the union and they are, former prison officers themselves, so they know what their members are going through.
It's not the biggest union in the world. We're talking about, 35,000 members or so. Nevertheless, it is really striking the way the leaders are completely connected, plugged into what's happening in the workplace.
A previous TUC General Secretary said that the POA is only a small trade union, but it punches above its weight tremendously. But it's also one of the most difficult trade unions to manage. And I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, well, without doubt, the POA is one of our key battalions, is how I see it in the trade union movement, because it has that history of solidarity, of discipline, of acting together as one. And of course, Steve Gillen is the face of the POA on the TUC General Council, and I can tell you, there's no way we'd ever forget about the priorities of the POA. Steve is a really able champion, but he's also incredibly popular. I see him as a friend. He's, you know, he's witty, but he's wise, and he's no pushover. You know, he's tough, but he uses his head as well as his heart.
He's very smart, he's a great sense of humour, quite a kindly guy. But I sometimes see the change in his face when he thinks someone's pushing it and you know, messing around prison officers and the POA, and I like that. You know, there is a kind of in the velvet glove there is an iron fist.
When I think back to some of the previous, you know, national chairs, some of the, you know, the big POA names, that I'm now a part of this, as are they. Yeah, it's an honour to be involved in it. Just to give people a brief history and get them to understand that through previous struggles we have had success, and to hopefully encourage them to be involved in future struggles as well.
You hear so much anti-trade union propaganda. I think it's right for people to know why it started, how it started, how people put their careers and their livelihoods on the line to actually form an organisation to protect working people. People that work in the special hospitals, that work in prisons, and now, of course, obviously work in prisons within the private sector.
It's vital to us to get our story out, to say, this is how we started, this is how we advanced, this is where we are now, and this is what we're going to be doing in the future.
You've got to know the struggles that your predecessors faced. And when you look at them and analyse them, a lot of them are similar to today's themes.
Trade unions were never started with the welcoming push of the employer. Not a chance. These rights were fought for people just like you and I, but maybe 100 years ago, maybe 50 years ago.
I think it's extremely important to log what happens at a particular point in time, and keep doing so. And it doesn't allow people to erase history, to erase what they want to erase and rewrite it for somebody else's benefit.
Well, many other countries, Italy, I think France and Germany, they teach about trade unions at school. Not here. People leave school, they don't know what a trade union is, they don't know that they should join it. When they find out, they're often over the moon. They're like, what, you mean that there's an organisation that exists basically solely to defend my rights at work?
It's fundamental. You don't know where you're going unless you know where you've come from, and unless you appreciate the struggles and the sacrifice of your grandparents and their grandparents and so on, you don't appreciate the value of the rights that we've got now and the need to hang on to them and fight to improve them for our grandchildren.
The need for a union to defend prison workers can be traced back to a period at the turn of the 20th century when the Prison Commission had only been administrated by central government for less than half a century. Victorian Britain saw a huge expansion of Britain's prison estates, 28 of which survive today of the 90 originally built on the hub-spoke layout, panopticon model, with wings of cells organised around a central hub for maximum visibility. The Prison Act of 1865 had brought an end to the piecemeal and regionally organised earlier prison system, which had been made up of bridewells, prison hulks, county jails, and alleviated by capital punishment and transportation measures. Up to this point, the salaried jailer was a rarity, but the 1865 Act established a staffing structure expected to include a jailer, a chaplain, a surgeon, and a matron in women's prisons. Prisons were further centralised in an 1877 Act, which set up a new body, the Prison Commission, to operate every aspect of prison administration under the watchful eye of the Home Secretary. Stuart McLaughlin is the custodian of the Wandsworth Prison Museum in the grounds of HMP Wandsworth, where some revealing and fascinating documents and artefacts from the POA's formative years are kept under lock and key.
The earliest reference I found about any form of discontent or unhappiness with prison officers was actually in references to 1890, where the Governor of Wandsworth reported that the officers of the prison had applied to be allowed to hold a meeting to discuss their position in the service, hours of duty, pay and other matters. The board reacted with less than alacrity. Pay, service, hours in duty, we still have those issues today.
At that time, see, there was nothing. The Victorian prison was a harsh environment. Capital punishment, corporal punishment was all there. All of it was there. And when I walked into Pentonville in 1967, the first cell that you went to on the left-hand side was the capital punishment cell. It's an indication of what the big prisons were like. Manchester, Liverpool, Weymouth Scrubs, Wandsworth, all the big prisons, the hard prisons, Dartmoor, that's what they were all like. And essentially, the staff, who had also come in the main from service life, knew how to behave, but they also knew what was lacking in their lives. And when the view came about that they had a magazine that they could read.
The roots of the POA can be traced back to the launch in 1910 of the underground magazine, the Warders magazine. Under the editorship of Fred Ludlow, the magazine was otherwise known as the Red 'Un, after the colour of its cover.
Pre-First World War, and we come to a magazine, the organ of His Majesty's Prison Service. It comes up with questions of an increase of pay, harking back to Wandsworth from the 1890s. And of course it was a whole prison service. It was for Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales. And what looks like to be, yes, a billiards match between Wandsworth and Pentonville, which resulted in a win for Wandsworth by 8 points. I'm sure Pentonville won't hold that against us.
I remember seeing the magazine. It was a dark red, had a dark red cover, a very good and useful communication tool. Prison officers could express their views.
We used to wait every month for the POA magazine to come out.
It's an event, actually, when you get the magazine slipping through the door in a concealed plastic bag. So it's not recognised as a prison officer's magazine.
There used to be a section in there, 3 or 4 pages, called branch jottings. You used to see what was happening in other establishments. That was actually more important to us than what the NEC was saying, because we could see what was happening.
In the 1980s, the magazine would change again to its current name, Gate Lodge. Its vital importance would remain the same.
There used to be a strapline under the name Gate Lodge, which was for prison officers, and I changed that to for POA members, because not all POA members are prison officers. They say to them, this magazine is for you.
If you think about the POA's history, starting with that magazine, the Red 'Un, you know, for the 21st century, I think a lot of this digital communications is the equivalent of that, you know, and it's cheap, it's mass, it's a way of reaching people, giving people heart, bringing people closer into the union.
From a works officer in Dartmoor who produced the magazine, the Red 'Un, they realised that they needed a collective voice. And more than a collective voice, they needed to actually act collectively. And that's what was the beginning of the POA.
It was initially backed by the Prison Commission, which quickly changed as it became increasingly militant in its tone, especially when taken over by maverick editor E.R. Ramsey, and the Red 'Un became known as the Bolshoi, a reference to the Bolshevik uprising after the Russian Revolution. Ramsey, real name Hubert Witchard, became a hero among prison officers across the land after taking the reins with vigour and upping the magazine's production with full member backing in 1915. This led in 1916 to the formation of the Prison Officers' Federation, which affiliated to the Labour Party in the same year.
The forerunner of the POA was the National Union of Police and Prison Officers, NUPO.
The POA tried to form itself, and being an affiliate to the Labour Party, that didn't last long. And then they were jointly with the police service.
That came about largely as a result of the strike in 1918 and 19 of the National Union of Police and Prison Officers.
There were a number of prison officers that went on strike in sympathy with them.
And they were all sacked.
The police were stopped from forming a union, But the prison officers had what they called a representative body, which was put in place, which really, when you look at the history and see what happened, was a management tool, really. It was an appeasement. They weren't a union, they weren't really an association, and they didn't have any teeth.
There was no hope of winning a case, and it was a nonsense. However good your case was, it was just rejected.
Whilst the Representative Board failed to secure most of the improvements in prison officers' conditions that it argued for, it did secure the replacement of the term warder by officer.
I mean, the warder itself does actually come from being somebody like in hospital wards, so it never actually sort of came with complete derogatory connotations. So it was, I think, December 1921 where the official notice finally came out that the term warder would no longer be used, as they believed the term officer reflected a much more professional class of worker in a prison. Most of the media tend to refer to us, if we're lucky, warders, sometimes just guards. We've never been guards. When I'm asked how many warders we have working in Wandsworth, I have to say we have no warders working in Wandsworth and haven't had any since 1921.
The additional disillusionment following the failure of the 1924 Labour government to reinstate the strikers severely disappointed many who had been involved in NUPO, compounding their disappointment over war bonuses being denied to prison officers in the wake of World War I.
And then the next 20 years or so, the predecessors of the POA, if you like, the representatives of rank and file officers trying to struggle with their employers for decent conditions, so some things never change.
This frustrating situation began to change in 1936 when a group of prison officers, including Harley Cronin, who had become weary of the failure of representative boards to win concessions, were elected to the Central Board. It was in the years between the two wars of the last century that the man who would prove vital to the formation and early growth of the POA would join the prison service.
He applied to police first, but they didn't think he was fat enough to be a policeman. And also he's half an inch short of 6 foot, so that was also against him. So he became a prison officer because that was his life, really, was this duty. He grew up with uniform. He went straight away into the Worcestershire Regiment as a soldier.
Hard as nails, he'd been built up in the hard school, and he knew there was no flim-flam with Harley. What you saw is what you got, and he spoke straight from the shoulder.
Certain things had to go from our life so that my father could do the job he did. And the main thing was family life. We forfeited a lot of time because we couldn't be all together as a family a lot. On the occasions that we were, we had happy times, but they were few and far between.
In these pre-POA years, meeting and membership had to be of the utmost secrecy, with union membership outlawed.
It does almost seem like the POA started out as something of a secret society because of the risk. And again, there's still quite a lot of risk as serving civil servants to do anything that might be deemed as a breach of the Civil Service Code, and it can be applied quite harshly.
I can openly talk to you in our communication strategies. Those brave national officials back then, the brave men and women, couldn't. In fact, most of the stuff was done in secret. It was done confidentially, because if they'd been found out, they would have been sacked. And more than probably, they could have been done for criminal activities as well.
And it wasn't just that they could lose their job. You were blacklisted. There were places that you couldn't then go to work even after losing your employment at that time.
Because my father was actually a civil servant of the king at the time, he could have lost everything.
And they went and then spoke to the Council of Civil Service Unions, the CSU, Len White, and all those boys.
He would meet sometimes in the Officers' Club, but usually on a one-to-one basis. I really didn't know anything about it. And of course, till much later, he got in touch with Len White to begin with, with Tex Rickard. I don't know where they met, probably in some pub, because he was a regular at the Holloway Castle.
And that was the big headquarters. Harley and Fred and the then national chairman, you know, they were all there.
My liver can attest to meeting prison officers and members of the POA in pubs where some of the work is done. It's not all done that way. You know, you share a drink with people and you can chat and you get an understanding. You also build trust, which I think is absolutely vital. But yeah, the POA is pretty good at that.
There was no other place for them to meet officially. The prison service didn't recognise the union at that time, and it didn't recognise the individuals at that time.
And nobody would be aware of these meetings, which would eventually lead to the recognition of the association.
The history of the POA is littered with tough decisions that they had to take in order to equalise, basically, what the prison service was like at that time. And they weren't very kind people, and they were used to getting answers. Once they'd ever asked you an opinion, they gave you an order. It was all instruction and orders. That's what they had grown up with in their service life, and that's what they wanted of prison officers.
The Central Board members made a formal demand to the Home Secretary, Sir Samuel Hoare, that prison officers should have the right to appeal to an independent arbitration board against employers' decisions.
There were some very brave and radical prison officers, had a meeting at a place called the Blue Glis Hall in London, campaigned, petitioned the Home Secretary of the day, and eventually the POA as we know it today was actually formed.
Eventually, around the time of the Second World War, we got the arbitration deal, and then the POA were allowed to be founded legally.
When the POA, through Harley Cronin, decided that this is what we wanted to do to get the recognition rights for collective bargaining and things like that, was the first stepping stones of us becoming an independent trade union.
The POA was granted a certificate of approval by the Treasury on the 25th of September 1939. As the ink was drying on those early documents of the POA's official beginnings, a global threat was on the horizon that would bring an abrupt and sharp focus of all priorities to the nation: the defeat of Hitler and Nazism in Europe.
The Prison Officers Association did come about, but of course it came about in September 1939, which clashed with a global event called World War II.
The good thing for the POA was that Harley was basically made the General Secretary, and he worked out of Wormer's Crabs for, I think, for basically the war years, you know.
My father had tried to enlist, but they wouldn't take him because he suffered with duodenal ulcers. They wouldn't accept him. He did his fire duty at Holloway Prison with the stirrup pump and bucket of sand and bucket of water. And that was his fire duty, to walk along the ramparts of Holloway, because they always got the early warnings of the Germans coming.
I think the union just had to take the hit on that one because of the national circumstances. But again, with someone like Harley Cronin, he was working on this in his own time quite freely. But it wasn't as if there was no work of a sort of General Secretary not being done. Harley Cronin was doing it anyway.
From what I've read, a very clever and a very astute man when dealing with politicians.
The connection to Westminster, you had to be there in order to get into the Home Office, because the reality was the Home Office were never going to come to you.
I do remember James Callaghan, before he was Prime Minister, he would represent the association. You needed somebody to speak for them to get certain things passed. My father's always got on fairly well with most parties.
They worked with them all, if they could, and essentially they did, but they never joined any of them.
I don't know how he would have got on with, say, people like Margaret Thatcher, or I don't think he would have, because of her dissolving all the unions.
His autobiography, Screw Turns, where he goes on record in many ways with his beliefs, coming out quite clearly, yes, I'm a socialist. But of course, that's on the backdrop that would most prison officers at that time have considered themselves socialists?
He would see so many injustices, as he called them, at the military school, and that really turned him more to socialism.
And again, the POA didn't ultimately get affiliated with the TUC until the 1960s, even though someone like Harley Cronin, yes, he was a socialist. He believed in trade unions, held that belief right to his core. But he also had to be mindful of who am I representing.
He appreciated what the branch secretaries did too. I mean, without them, I guess, and him, there wouldn't be an association really, because it got so big and you had to have people that could communicate from the branch level.
Cronin's daughter Mary was involved in the early communication work of the newly formed union, in assisting her father, the freshly elected first General Secretary, as the union flourished and began to hold its first conferences.
Living on top of the job as it was, you couldn't help but be involved in all that stuff. I used to help out occasionally. Couple of conferences, he would rough type the minutes, give them to me, and then I would take what was passed and what was not passed, and what was said and what was discussed.
There were no computers. You had to get on with making your own notes. So there was a lot of secretarial work to be done. It got you used to being meticulous. Whether it was handy for the executive or not, you had to write the truth. That was essential.
Following the war years, Cronin steered the union through some turgid times before handing the reins to Fred Castell.
The only reason he retired was he felt Fred Castell should be given the opportunity to be the General Secretary. Otherwise, I think he would have carried on till he died.
Fred Castell is the General Secretary I really remember. And of course, Castell House, our office in Northern Ireland, is named after Fred Castell because he actually was from Northern Ireland.
During these first 20 years of the POA under Cronin in the post-war period, the first Whitley councils were set up. It was used by civil servants to press for the right to represent members employed at Broadmoor and other special hospitals.
If we go back to Broadmoor, we can go back to when that opened in 1863. That was the first major criminal lunatic asylum, as it was called then, at Broadmoor. And the staff that worked there were hospital orderlies, lunatic attendants. They came in a variety of names and titles, and they were involved in action in 1918-19 and in 1939 involved in the formation of what was to become the Prison Officers Association. So Broadmoor is one of the earliest branches of the POA.
The POA remains the largest union at the 4 specials, Ashworth, Broadmoor, Rampton and at Carstairs in Scotland, and has growing membership in the many regional medium secure units around the UK.
You have to ensure that they are an integral part of the union and always have been.
And we've got a real strong membership within them.
Each member has one share in this organisation, no matter where you work.
Some people felt alienated in the POA. We had nurses, we had works officers, we had operational support grades. They felt a little bit alienated. And Brian Caton, the previous General Secretary, brought it to the table that we should change the name to simply POA, with a strapline, the professional trade union that represents prison officer grades, OSGs, and all ancillary people, and the special hospitals, of course.
In more recent times, the name was amended by National Conference to secure psychiatric units to better reflect the work these members do. The 1960s rolled on. Some more wholesale changes and challenges were on the horizon that would face POA members across the whole prison estate. One radical game changer that would pose totally new challenges for the prison service and the POA alike was the increasing call for an end to capital punishment. The POA initially opposed the abolition of the death penalty on the basis that convicted murderers serving life sentences would be difficult to manage.
When capital punishment ended, large sentences started to be given out, life sentences, so there were more life sentence prisoners. Big sentences being given out, and you had lifers who probably before capital punishment may well have faced the death penalty, people like Ian Brady, Raymond Morris and people like that, who had to be, you know, looked after for the rest of their life, basically, in prison. So it was a significant change for prison staff, and I don't think that the prison service just sort of took account of that. They didn't join the dots between the sentencing and what staff needed to do the job, basically. They were expected to just carry on and go with the flow, as it were. And then coupled with that, you had the high-profile escape. So you had the great train robbers, and you had the famous escape of Ronald Biggs, etc. You had George Blake, the spy who was serving 42 years, escaped as well. And of course, that brought about what we call the Mountbatten Report.
He's the one who gave us categories A, B, C and D. Came up with the idea of giving us radios for internal use, CCTV, and actually sealing off parts of the jail to create a sterile area as an inner boundary.
That was overtaken then by the Rudzinowitz report, which was a report that recommended that the long-term difficult prisoners should be dispersed into a number of prisons.
And like a lot of prison reports, of course, it was all recommendations.
It changed the prison service because it made it face up to the inadequacies of the system and the poor buildings that we were working in, the poor conditions that prisoners were living in. You know, the slopping out, the constant, it was horrendous. And Mountbatten gave us the first kick in the right direction of trying to change the system.
He introduced an intermediate rank to supervise, because all you used to get in a wing was the most senior officer, as it were, supervising other staff. So he introduced a rank to do that, which needed qualifications, which was quite right.
He was essentially beneficial to the staff. He was insistent that the staff would be treated fairly. Prison governors wanted to change, and the union wanted to change. And that agenda, we moved that agenda forward.
Overcrowding and understaffing in Britain's ageing jails, full of now dispersed violent criminals, would lead to an increase in prison riots and violence against staff, with the murder of a prison officer no longer a capital crime.
We were talking about Portland. We weren't talking about Pentonville. We weren't talking about Manchester or, you know, or the big jails where most of the bad prisoners were held. We're talking about Portland. And if they could kill a prison officer in Portland, they could kill him anywhere. And that was it. It proved to everybody from the POA and in the POA how vulnerable our positions were, how important it was to stick together in order to get some change going.
Whilst the fear of an increase in the number of prison officers murdered did not transpire in mainland Britain, when the violent disturbances that would become known as the Troubles broke out in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s, the risk that the ultimate price might be paid by POA members there became all too real and frequent.
And Northern Ireland, with the difficulties they went through at the end of the 60s, 70s, 80s, very much were in our thoughts all the time, and it was always a close link with us.
I basically live in a fort. My house is bulletproof, big electric gates and all. The amount of threats that I've had, was job to represent prison officers, and I done it. I just wasn't going to run away from it, you know. It didn't matter what the threats were.
So families were intimidated out of their house overnight by paramilitaries. The family literally had to get out of the house straight away. And the POA office, that was the only place they could turn to.
I went there in 1972, at the end of 1972, to Longcash. Now that's a hard place. That was a hard place.
It was very courageous to come over, because believe it or believe it not, these paramilitaries actually, when you got a new English officer on they were able to suss them out on no time at all, because they could pick up immediately where you worked, what were your children, what school they went to, and everything about you.
They needed the staff to come from what we call across the water, across the pond. Couldn't get staff here because of the security situation. It certainly wasn't a walk in the park for those staff, and the conditions weren't great.
Finlay and June campaigned for many years to establish a memorial garden for Northern Ireland POA members who had fallen in the line of duty.
And eventually, in 2016, they agreed to open up a memorial garden for prison officers. In fact, the stone wall's down there.
It's a memorial service. My dad used to come. He was an active member of the POA. He gave everything, even when he was off the clock. You know, the phone never stopped ringing. He was out at all hours. Anybody needed them, he was there. He was a big union man. He lived and breathed it. He really loved it and lost his life for his job. It's important to see the officers and the retired officers and the cenotaph itself. You know, there's a bigger meaning there for me. The POA are incredible. They were wonderful to my mum, and they're lovely to me too. It's just, even a phone call, just to get that phone call from Michelle, you know, once a fortnight or whatever, it's just really, really nice. Yeah, my dad was Brian Armour, and I couldn't be more proud to be his daughter.
It is great. It is a place that you can come to. You can remember everybody, not just your husband, but you can remember a lot of the other people who served with them as well. And it's great to be here as all together.
And it's so that those prison officers that lost their lives just for the job that they did are remembered and will always be remembered.
And before I retired, I made sure that Northern Ireland had its own headquarters. And that pleases me greatly.
Like most families, this has involved its moments and periods of falling out. In 1971, the Scottish Prison Officers Association broke away from the POA.
My understanding of it is because I'm thankfully too young to have been around at the time to be party to that. But John, as you rightly said, behind us on the wall, was the treasurer, I think, at the time. They always felt, I think, that they were just treated as a large branch. Although members of the NEC at the time were against the move in that direction, the membership themselves decided that they wanted an independent trade union in Scotland that dealt with issues solely related to Scotland. So it really came from feeling that their voice wasn't being heard and that they didn't have enough influence over the big decisions that needed to be taken.
The SPOA became POA Scotland in 2000 when a merger took place.
The merger with the POA, as far as the SPO were concerned at the time, was a result of the riots of late 80s, and court actions that took place after that. They were all found not guilty, but the trade union in Scotland suffered financially as a result of that.
They're really good people in Scotland, and I have a great regard for them. So one of the nice things that I did, and they all agreed, of course, was to come back and join the POA, which was wonderful.
Over 3,000 members in Scotland. We've got an excellent Scottish National Committee who do the business day in, day out on behalf of the membership in Scotland. Since I took over as General Secretary, I very rarely interfere in Scottish matters unless it's a financial issue or a legal issue or anything like that that could impact massively on the union. They've got total autonomy.
In Scotland, which was the same union but a different employer, they had partnership working, which was absolutely working to a T. We asked ACAS to look at the Scottish model, as we used to call it, and say, can we not introduce that model? And it was objected to by the heads of the prison service and also by the Labour government then, who said no.
In Scotland, we can have arrangements that respect some of those principles, but in England, for some reason, we can't. I think the government is looking more and more ridiculous in the inconsistency, but also it's draconian to deny people that basic human right to withdraw your labour.
New Labour legislation, introduced by the Conservative government in 1992, laid down that the POA could no longer be a trade union. This was reversed in the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, but prison officers were still denied the right to take industrial action, meaning that the POA could not call strike action amongst its members.
There was nothing in legislation prior to 1994 to say that prison officers could not strike. So industrial action was taken by prison officers, but it was never a week's action. It was more restrictions to the regime. So they would shut down the workshops. So the government at the time, in the early 1990s, they were looking at ways, I think, to probably break the POA.
What our members don't know was the strength that we had as a trade union led to the 1994 Criminal Justice Act, where they turned around and said to you, we're wary of what you are and we're worried about what you can do, so we're going to take those rights off you.
The ban on strikes in England and Wales, that's just a recipe for bad management and incompetence and ministers getting it wrong.
We've had waves and waves of anti-union legislation from Conservative governments, looking really to rig the balance of power between employers and workers, because the truth is an individual worker will never be as strong as their employer. The only way we balance it up is by joining together in a union, but critically having that, what I regard as a human right, to withdraw your labour.
And the POA has been at the forefront amongst all other unions of pointing that out, the attacks that there are on trade unions, but also demonstrating what sort of reforms are needed and being able to mobilise their members accordingly.
Yeah, my understanding of the right to strike or it being taken away, that growing issues in industrial relations in the prison service and the POA resulted in the first national strike, and the reaction to that was to immediately reapply 126 and 127 and then follow it up with possible changes to that to make it even harder for us to take any form of action. Subsequently, where we have taken action, we have done it on health and safety. On the most recent one, again, we have a permanent injunction against us taking any form of industrial action. That would be enough to get an injunction from the POA to even discuss taking industrial action.
Whenever we take industrial action, they always quote that we can't have prison officers going on strike because they're so essential to the running of the country and they're a vital public service. Treat us like one then.
And then why do you then penalise those workers in the private prisons who are answerable to the shareholders, that they can't even take industrial action for their rights in the workplace? We are public sector workers doing an essential job. And why don't we have the same privileges of the police? Retirement after 30 years with a full pension, as opposed to state pension age of 68. These privileges and these rights don't seem to exist, but that privilege and right is used to simply beat us with an injunction stick.
There's been times when the POA has not been particularly popular with governments, and that's why they've denied them some basic trade union rights, and that's why at times government ministers and others have attacked the POA. Why have they attacked the POA? Because it's a union that speaks truth to power.
And that eventually comes to a nexus whereby people say enough's enough. You need to pay us properly. You need to give us some time off. You need to recognise our skill sets and our qualifications. And the POA have been one of the best trade unions I've ever seen at driving those arguments forward. The fact that the government saw the need to bring an injunction against people, right, when they're identifying unsafe working practices tells you the strength of the POA, tells you that they were right in what they were doing and why they were doing it. And ultimately, it would get interesting if somebody got hurt, if somebody was killed, because the government prevented people from standing up and having a voice to protect themselves from unsafe acts.
People have no idea that prison officers don't have this basic rights, not just to strike, but to take any kind of industrial action at all, even working to rule. Not even the industrial stuff, but saying it's a clear and present danger to our members' health and safety, therefore we have the duty actually to, under the Health and Safety Act, to take whatever action, bang, injunction, straight to the High Court. When people learn that, then I think not just their empathy for the officers grows, but also they realise just what the union is up against.
I remember Steve Gillen famously saying, well, arrest me if you want to, but who's going to turn the key? Which I thought was extremely brave and extremely funny at the same time.
But I've never been afraid of it. But I'm not going to say that I've got any desire to break the law and go to jail. That would be stupidity to even suggest that. But I've never ever, as General Secretary, repudiated any action that any branch has ever taken under health and safety legislation. And I told the court that I never would.
You do need to have a relationship with employers, you need to deal with people you may not like or may not agree with politically in order to get outcomes for your members. And no one would thank the POA or any other leadership for being constantly in dispute. You need to get results and get outcomes, and they've been remarkably effective at doing that.
Industrial action was something, to be quite frank with you, was alien to prison officers. It wasn't what we first thought of, but it became the only way to actually make them, as governors, stop and think. And to say to the government, we've had enough. This is it, and we're going no more.
The Tony Blair-led New Labour government, much like previous Labour governments before them, had promised to overturn this if elected, just as it promised to end prison privatisation.
Now, of course, New Labour in opposition made promises to the POA that that would be removed as soon as they came to power. So in 1997, we waited, and we continued waiting.
Early 2000s, there was a rise of the awkward squad of trade union leaders who just saw Labour was in power, and yep, that Labour government transformed people's lives in many, many ways, but it was far from perfect. And there's always going to be that tension between a party in power and the trade unions representing the people at the sharp end.
One of the sad things for me personally was we met many leaders, leading members of the Labour Party, as it was fashioning itself New Labour, who made promises in regard to reversing the decision. And Blair and Straw, Prescott, met with us and promised a return. Of course, history tells us that once again, these were political promises that were broken, and broken very quickly.
This right was restored in 2004 to prison officers in the public sector in England, Wales and Scotland, but not in Northern Ireland, or to prison officers in the private sector.
And then we did have a visit from the Home Secretary Jack Straw, and it was announced that Section 126 and 127 would be disapplied. However, that doesn't mean removal from the statute books.
The POA then signed a voluntary no-strike agreement in return for pay claims being dealt with by a succession of unsatisfactory pay review board mechanisms, and the relationship between the union and the prison service became rockier and ultimately broke down completely.
Joint Industrial Relations Procedural Agreement. That's what it was. But what we found as we came to it and we brought disputes to the table, the then prison service leadership had the right to strike them out. So what we then decided as a leadership was to withdraw from Germa.
That sent ripples through government when they realised how together the POA were.
In 2007, I was privileged, and I say privileged, to lead the first national strike in the history of the POA. There had to be a realisation of what prison officers are worth, not just financially worth, but worth. And that's the message I tried to take to the government of the day.
The other colour was you just had to listen. You listened and it was soft and it was all right, and then there was a change of gear. And it was like 0 to 60 in about 5 seconds. You could be a good friend or a very bad enemy.
We've always had the ballot box, but it wasn't really until Colin Moses came along that it was used. And then all of a sudden that power was given to our members, and that was a fantastic thing, because as a prison officer, as a POA member, and as a trade unionist, that was when the union turned around and said no.
We were dealing with people who had never been on strike before in their lives. We went into it with a very united front. We had all the branches out, except for one, I think, at the time. But as the day grew on, cracks appeared.
Governor we had at the time locked off access to any toilets, even though we got pregnant women stood outside with us. Other establishments, I know that governors took tea and coffee out for them because they fully understood where we were coming from. But staff morale, majority of it was really good, and they felt they were standing up for themselves.
That action was very high risk because you're facing a government that has a battery of lawyers, unlimited funds, huge power, and as a trade union, as an individual prison officer, you're taking a risk, there's no question. But when there's a legitimate grievance and you're just not getting anywhere, what else do you do?
But it was a long day, a very long day, and it's one that'll go down in history because it's never been done since.
The pressure from the then government through the courts, and the NEC was sitting, wasn't a singular decision or a double decision between myself and the General Secretary. The NEC of the day decided after 12 hours that we would call a halt to it, and we went into talks with Straw the following day, and there wasn't a result. It wasn't a result we wanted, so it was deemed a defeat.
We as a National Executive didn't know whether the membership would follow us, and they did. And that, for me, was a day I'll never, ever forget.
Yeah, I'm proud of that day. I'm proud that we took a decision, but you also remember that we had also had a ballot, a gate players ballot leading up to that, which had overwhelmingly said to take any action we saw fit.
In January 2008, the Home Secretary announced that the government planned to reintroduce powers to ban strike by prison officers in England and Wales. Undeterred by the restriction upon the ability to take industrial action, on the 10th of May 2012, the POA called a 5-hour strike action in support of fellow TUC-affiliated trade unions in protest against the government-imposed changes to the civil service pension scheme. This strike action launched the emotive campaign 68 is too late. In 2019, the POA NEC called on their members to take this message to Westminster, where they would lobby Parliament over this and the lingering issues of violence and privatisation of prisons, as well as the effects of austerity.
The group gathered behind us is a mixture of Prison Officer Association members, so prison officers. We've also got people coming from PCS, UCU, a couple of other unions. So we just want our voice to be heard.
We've got people from all over the United Kingdom, England, Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland.
And me, along with a whole batch of our colleagues from the Scottish prisons, have come down to support our colleagues in England and Wales on what is ultimately a joint venture around pay and pensions in particular, and the fact that we're in a ludicrous situation where we're being asked to operate in a gallery at the age of 68.
And it's a three-pronged approach. It's to reduce our retirement age to 60, it's to highlight the violence that we face, and it's to say to politicians, bring back prisons into state ownership.
Prison officers haven't got the right to strike, so what we're doing, we're having the right to protest, and nobody can stop us from doing that.
It's letting politicians know that we won't stand for this any longer. We're getting assaulted at record rates, and we're getting older, so we need someone to step in now, the government to step in and help us. We've given up our rest days for this. We're here because it needs to change before prison officers killed on duty.
You can't take £900 million out of the budget and expect everything to run like clockwork. We'll get 8,000 fewer prison officers since 2010. It just doesn't add up. We need more staff, better pay, decent pension age, and then do the job that we're paid to do. In actual fact, what that means is rehabilitation for prisoners and restoring order to our prisons. The prison service is in crisis up and down the country, and it's because of these measures under the so-called austerity.
And they continue to deny it, but the link between austerity and rising levels of violence and staff cuts is proven. Over 10,000 prison officers were assaulted in the last 12 months alone, which is unacceptable. Today, they call it a POA march, but it's not going to be a march, it's more like going to be a hobo.
Where people come into the job and they look and see what they've got to do, and they're not prepared to suffer the violence on a day-to-day basis when they can get paid better elsewhere.
It's important for us to get the message across to the Tory government that we couldn't possibly continue to work in the most hostile and violent workplace in Western Europe in our 60s, and that's why we're calling for them to sit down with us and negotiate a reinstatement of our retirement age of 60 so we can have dignity and respect when we do retire.
68 is too late! It's been very effective. The power of protest is always a good one, and as you will see, we brought the traffic to a standstill near Downing Street and so forth. It's always good to flex your muscle in relation to that, and it's a peaceful protest. And I think our members have done exceptionally well today.
But we've seen them attack the fire service. We've seen the cuts in the police service. We've seen the massive cuts in the NHS.
Well, it was a great privilege and an honour to speak at the rally in London on behalf of the POA, purely because I've met so many members of the POA, I've met so many members of the executive, and I've met Steve Gillen, and they've enthused me right over the issues that they're standing for. It is right that everybody has a right to strike. It is right that everybody has a right to protect themselves from poor bosses, because nobody goes and strike for no reason at all, and nobody loses money when they don't want to. Somebody has to drive them to that. And I can't think of one strike in the history of the movement that's been done for any other reason than the needs of the members, whether it be remuneration, whether it be protection, or people being hurt by the actions of a poor employer. And what made me want to speak and stand up on the issues such as retirement and dignity and pensions and the right to strike for the POA was their overarching belief in what they wanted to achieve. And how can you not be enthused by that?
The global pandemic temporarily paused some of the POA's issues, but all of these recurring struggles for the POA remain as prisons unlock in the wake of COVID. And although the everlasting staircase goes on, understanding where we've come from can only inform and inspire our union in where we're going.
You've got to be resolute in order to succeed. Nothing comes easy in the trade union movement, and you've got to fight for it.
And the POA is committed to encouraging, younger people, a more diverse membership at local and national level, and that's important for the POA.
I just want equality for all. I want everyone in the POA to feel part of a family, and I want them to get active with their union and start joining us on the campaign trail to make our prisons safe again, to reduce that retirement age, and to make sure there's a pay structure in place that rewards their brave work on the front line and doesn't force them into working a long hours culture so they can feed their families.
The NEC are not the POA. The branch committee are not the POA. The people who go to work every day and pay their subs, they are the POA.
Our history is important, but the future is even more important. We shape our future, but we should never forget our history of where we've come from. We can't change that, but what we can do is shape going forward. And I would urge anyone who has an interest in the POA, become a local official and work your way up to national level and stand for the National Executive Committee and stamp your mark so as that you can then go down in history as someone that's come along. But you've got to look at where we've come from and then strive in the future to maintain that and to make it better going forward as well for future people coming into the service.